Alicia Moore was born with special needs on February 23, 1996. In 2012, 16-year-old Alicia was a high school student in Greenville, Texas. Sadly, she would never make it to the age of 17. On Friday, November 2, 2012, at 3:25 p.m., surveillance video captured the last moments of her life as she exited the school bus near her home. She told friends earlier that day that after school, she and her uncle, Michael Moore, were headed to Paris, Texas, to meet a guy. However, after getting off the school bus, she was never seen alive again. When she failed to return home that night, her family reported her missing. As investigators began searching for her, friends, family, and even teachers were interviewed in hopes of finding some crucial information. The following day, the school's technology department attempted to track her school-issued iPad, but it had strangely been reset, making it untraceable. 4 days later, her family's worst fear came to life when Alicia's body was found by a construction crew 40 miles from her home in Van Zandt County, Texas. Her nude body had been stuffed in a trunk and tossed over a bridge railing. An autopsy determined she had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death. Sadly, this wasn't the first time someone took advantage of Alicia. A couple of years before her murder, when she was only 13 years old, 49-year-old Terry Ramsire had sexually assaulted her on multiple occasions. He was arrested 3 months before Alicia's murder, but deemed mentally unfit to stand trial. He ultimately pleaded guilty to the charges. Allegedly, there were other men taking advantage of her, and sadly, her family did nothing to protect her. Meanwhile, investigators continued interviewing friends and family and were able to rule everyone out except for her uncle, Michael. He was the only one who couldn't provide a solid alibi on the day she disappeared. He tried to tell investigators that his truck had broken down west of Dallas in Grand Prairie, but his cell phone pings showed he was actually in Greenville. Finally, 7 months after her murder in May of 2013, Michael was arrested and charged with her murder after the biological DNA from her sexual assault kit matched his DNA. In the end, he was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The story doesn't end there because CPS had been notified of the alleged abuse and didn't handle it properly. 3 employees, Laura, Natalie, and Rebecca, had changed paperwork to cover up their negligence in the case that involved a risk assessment of Alicia's mother, Aretha Moore. Once this was discovered, all 3 of them were arrested and charged with tampering with evidence. 2 of them were found guilty of official oppression, while the charges against the third were ultimately dropped. Angelica Milan was born on April 14, 1985, and went by Angel. On May 19, 2005, she and her boyfriend, David Ross Kilo Sr., had a son named David Ross Jr., whom they nicknamed Little Tater. Over a year later, on December 12, 2006, they had another son named Daniel Reese, and they nicknamed him Little Boone. In December of 2010, 25-year-old Angel, along with David Sr. and their 2 sons, moved in with his father in Meridian, Mississippi. Sadly, about a week later, a horrible tragedy occurred. 2 days before Christmas, on December 23, 2010, David's father returned home from work at 4:30 p.m. and found Angel shot to death on the couch. Unfortunately, things would only get worse from there. In the hallway was Angel's son, also shot to death, and in the bedroom was her other son, who suffered the same fate. The son in the bedroom was found lying next to the murder weapon and his father, who had also been shot to death. Investigators determined that David had shot and killed his entire family between 7 and 7:30 a.m. that morning before turning the gun on himself. The motive behind the tragedy remains unknown, but Angel's brother Jeff is trying to make sure his sister and nephews, 5-year-old Little Tater and 4-year-old Little Boone, are never forgotten. Angie Colleen Anders was born in Shreveport, Louisiana on October 9, 1974, to Michael Anders and Carla Lindsay. After high school, she earned a degree in general studies from Louisiana State University in Shreveport. Angie's sister Misty described her as a talented singer and writer who was known for her boisterous laugh and dazzling smile. She was a very accomplished individual who had served as vice president of the Oasis Foundation in Florida and participated in an AIDS walk alongside Johnny Knoxville in California. She was also the volunteer coordinator with Okaloosa AIDS Support and Informational Services, a family advocate at the Providence House Emergency Shelter, administrative coordinator for teams, and office manager at the Council on Alcoholism and Drug Abuse of Northwest Louisiana. In 2019, she opened Kai Long Martial Arts and Boxing School and created a scholarship to help children who were unable to attend due to finances. Unfortunately, Angie, the mother of 2 daughters, was in a very tumultuous relationship with 58-year-old William Cherry, who went by Jeff. Jeff was a convicted felon who was known for his violent tendencies and had abused women in the past, and he treated Angie no differently. In July of 2021, she ended the relationship after discovering that he and a friend of his had hired a prostitute. She then filed for an order of protection and wrote in it that he was homicidal and she was scared he was going to kill her. She also said that he owned several firearms, which was illegal due to his felony conviction. That conviction dates back to November 1995, when he shot his previous girlfriend, Sarah Camperman, after she broke off their engagement. On the evening of Friday, November 24, 1995, the day she gave him the ring back, she returned to Cherry's home at 5 p.m. to drop off a birthday present for Cherry's brother and to see him before going to her parents' home. They spoke in the bedroom for about 20 minutes, during which time Cherry said he was depressed about losing his job and Sarah and wanted her to reconsider the breakup. At some point, she went outside to grab the present, and when she returned to the bedroom, she found Cherry in a now semi-reclined position on the bed with a pillow on his lap. As the conversation resumed, Cherry became more upset and crying. He also appeared to be having trouble breathing. Sarah felt bad and moved closer to console him, at which point his demeanor changed. He was no longer crying and was now breathing fine. To Sarah's surprise, he stood up, dropped the pillow, reached out his arm, and shot her in the hand and chest. It turns out that when she went to get the present out of her car, he grabbed a gun and hid it under a pillow. After Sarah fell to the floor, she begged Cherry to call 911, but he refused. In an effort to save herself, she told Cherry that she would tell authorities that the shooting was an accident and said she would remain in the relationship if he called 911. He accepted the offer, placed the ring back on her finger, and called 911. He then stuck to the story that the shooting was an accident. While he was originally charged with attempted second-degree murder, the court couldn't find enough evidence for that charge and dropped it down to aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. After being convicted, he was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but only served 2 of it. Unfortunately, Angie would not be as lucky as Sarah. Around midnight on April 14, 2022, police responded to a call about shots fired in the 500 block of Atkins Avenue in Shreveport. When officers arrived, they found Angie in the driver's seat of a red SUV, dying from a gunshot wound. Investigators were quickly able to determine that Cherry was the shooter based on witness statements and the fact that the SUV belonged to him. Plus, the incident occurred on the same street he lived on, and after killing her, he fled inside his home and a 6-hour standoff began. Authorities deployed a robot into the upstairs portion of the home and found Cherry dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. As for Angie, she was transported to Ochsner LSU Health Hospital and sadly died at 12:10 a.m. Crissy Lee Jacks, who is more commonly known by friends and family as Crissy Hayes, was born on March 8, 1976, to parents Mona and Terry. In 2020, 44-year-old Crissy was a mother of 3 living in Banks, Arkansas, where she worked as a body repair mechanic and a mechanical engineering inspector. She was very close with her children and parents and loved her 2 grandbabies. She had recently started dating a man named Ryan Phillips, and they quickly fell in love and got engaged. She was a very active person who thoroughly enjoyed life until it was sadly cut short one day. On July 13, 2020, her friends became concerned after being unable to get in touch with her, so they called the sheriff's department and requested a welfare check. When they arrived and entered her home, they sadly found her stabbed to death. Since there was no sign of forced entry, investigators suspected she knew and trusted her killer. It was also strange because she had only been in the area for a short while, and few people knew where she lived. It wouldn't take investigators long to realize that earlier that day, Crissy had a satellite dish installed. The man who installed it was 26-year-old Dylan Estes, and as they dug into his past, they discovered some shocking information. Estes used to work in law enforcement but was fired and listed as ineligible for rehire. It's unclear the reason, but he was known for getting in trouble dating back to when he was a juvenile. He had also spent time in a psychiatric facility. While it looked like they had their man, they still needed to confirm it with lab tests, but due to the pandemic, everything was backed up. Finally, over a year later, on July 27, 2021, investigators were officially able to identify Estes as Crissy's killer. On the day of the murder, Estes showed up, installed the satellite dish, and left. He then returned later that day and stabbed Crissy to death from behind. After being arrested, he pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 6 to 30 years in prison. As for a motive, that remains unknown. Crissy's mother, Mona, then sued both Dish Network and the installation contract company, Southern Star. Apparently, no background check was ever performed on Estes. If they had, Crissy would most likely still be alive. On October 3, 2023, people in the area near the Return to Nature funeral home in Penrose, Colorado, began reporting an abhorrent smell coming from their 2,500 square foot building. The funeral home was opened in 2017 by husband and wife John and Carrie Halford with the purpose of providing burials without the need for embalming, chemicals, or metal caskets. Surprisingly, this practice is legal in the state of Colorado, but requires the bodies to be refrigerated within 24 hours of death. As for the cremations, they were handled by third-party crematoriums. The business began going downhill when the Halfords got themselves into serious financial trouble and were unable to pay their bills. You might think they did the responsible thing and closed the business, especially once the company's registration expired, but you'd be wrong. They actually did the complete opposite, and before everything was over, they would be arrested and sued by 200 families and 2 different companies, and what was left was a warehouse of horrors. They were first sued by Kennedy and Company for breach of their lease agreement at the Platte Avenue location. They owed the landlord over $97,000 for rent and damages to the property. They were also sued by Wilbert Funeral Services for over $21,000. On the day authorities received reports of the smell, they arrived at the building and made a horrifying discovery. Inside, they found an estimated 115 bodies stacked on top of each other. They were left to rot at room temperature and were eventually covered by hungry maggots. After the remains were transported back to the El Paso County Coroner's Office, they discovered there were actually a total of 190 bodies. This left one big question. If 190 bodies were left inside the building, what were in the urns of unsuspecting family members? It turns out that the Halfords instead gave grieving family members urns with dry concrete mix and falsified death certificates. At that point, all the bodies had to be identified, and the family members were notified about the fake ashes. What's crazy is that the building had refrigeration units, but they weren't operational when the bodies were discovered. Investigators also visited the Halfords' Platte location, but found the building empty with a for sale sign out front. Meanwhile, the Halfords had fled back to Oklahoma to avoid the impending arrest. The following month, in November of 2023, they were located in Oklahoma, arrested, and charged with 190 counts of abuse of a corpse, 5 counts of theft, 4 counts of money laundering, and more than 50 counts of forgery. Some of their charges are the result of the couple fraudulently obtaining nearly $900,000 in pandemic relief funds, which they used to purchase cars, vacations, tuition for their child, cryptocurrency, and cosmetic procedures. After their arrest, text messages were found between the couple from before they went on the run, where they were caught discussing digging a big hole for the 190 remains. They also suggested that after the remains were in the hole, they could treat it with lye or set the bodies on fire. Here is one of the texts he wrote to his wife when they were trying to figure out what to do with the bodies. "I want to take a shower as soon as I get back because while I was making the transfer, I got people juice on me. Want the double cheeseburger, lettuce, wrapped with everything, minus tomatoes, please." One of the bodies located in the warehouse was for a former Army Sergeant First Class, who his family believed was buried by the funeral home at a veterans cemetery. However, when the wooden casket was dug up, they found a woman inside. Investigators estimated the amount of money taken from the families amounted to $130,000. The families then sued the Halfords, who failed to show up to the hearings. Never once did they apologize or show remorse to the families, and in the end, they were ordered to pay $950 million. However, it's unlikely that money will ever be paid. The Halfords were then offered a plea deal for the state charges, which not all family members were happy about. If they accept, it would require John Halford to serve 20 years and Carrie to serve 15 to 20 years. Thankfully, a law has since been passed that requires funeral home operators to hold a Mortuary of Science degree, pass a national board examination, complete a 1-year apprenticeship, and pass a criminal background check. John Halford was notorious for making bad decisions. In 2006, he and 2 others staged a robbery prank on a group of young women at a slumber party in Wagner County, Oklahoma. He and his friends had entered the women's home wearing masks and holding unloaded firearms. At the time, he was running for Muskogee City Council, and after receiving charges for the robbery prank, he suffered an overwhelming loss. That same year, he was ordered to pay over $8,000 to Creditors Recovery Corporation. Then, in 2009, he was forced to pay $1,000 to an apartment complex after being served a forcible entry and detainer and failing to appear in court. A forcible entry and detainer, also known as FED, is an action taken by a landlord when a tenant refuses to leave after being given a notice to vacate. It also seems the couple had run a funeral home in Oklahoma under the name Halford Cremation and Funeral Options, LLC. In 2011, their LLC was sued by Shannon Square Holdings, LLC, in order to pay over $5,000 after he once again failed to show up to court for the hearing. While the details of the lawsuit are unclear, this was most likely over finances when they lived in Oklahoma. In January 2024, demolition of the warehouse began and was completed in April. At this time, their plea hearing is scheduled for October 24, 2024, and their sentencing will take place in early 2025. As for the state charges, that plea hearing is scheduled for November 8, 2024.